so it remains to be seen what happens. What happens there? So I think that's the next.
I guess my broader question
I
is:
don't know.
are you seeing this having a larger effect regionally?
Well, I think what's entirely possible is, I think these countries are very different. So to say that the contagion effect is definitely going to affect, is definitely going to produce these results, these kind of revolutions elsewhere, I think is a bit of a stretch. But what I think is significant is that people are, having seen the Tunisians put themselves in a line, having seen the Egyptians put themselves in a line in front of tanks, in front of soldiers, the degree to which people may fear this appears to have diminished. They see it happen in Tunisia. Tunisians made it happen. Egyptians made it happen. And so I think it reduces what people call this barrier of fear. That may be the most significant effect.
Jeremy, any thoughts on that?
No, I think that the point that these are very different countries is something we have to keep in mind, because even though there seems to be a common wave through the region, conditions and the way the governments will react extremely different in each case.
Okay. May, and I don't know if you're going to work into your question what didn't happen in Syria.
I was actually going to step off onto that one. I have a two-part question. One is talking about media analysis. I was watching Rashid Khalidi interview with The Economist, and his big point was that this all proved that there is an Arab sphere, right? And that people are interacting within it and kind of, supporting your argument that the fact that most of these Arab countries, even including North Africa, which has a complicated identity with Arab and Arabism, is watching the same media that somebody in Syria or Kuwait's watching. So I'm wondering, what is the level of penetration of, let's say, these images of the demonstration, and how is it being spun in national media television? And that's how I was going to kind of segue to Syria, which is it even enough, the fact that the barrier of fear is broken down because the memory of something like Hama in 1982 is still fresh in people's mind, and the idea of such severe punishment that the government would enact to its own population. Is that enough? And I know these are all different countries, so it's hard to kind of take it as a blanket statement.
I just wanted to say to your last point again, I'm also not a media expert analyst at all. But something that's interesting in what you're saying at the very end, is it enough? I think that's the question that every single day that people were asking. It's 18 days, it's 10 days, but now it's 18 days into it. And it's done, so we think, we hope. But I think what's really interesting about that is people, every single country is really different. So even before the protests, like in Tunisia, when people were burning themselves, literally because they didn't have any food or they lost jobs, people started replicating that in Egypt. And that was the biggest critique. Like, we're not Tunisia, we're Egypt. Don't, especially like, that's really negative, you're killing yourself on fire. And then when Tunisia at first started burning cars, it was like, kind of, I think the question I want to ask about, is this going to replicate? No one knows. But there's things where people are just taking it and saying, okay, well, they put themselves in front of the tank, but they're not analyzing the fact that why the tank's not firing on people at all. So we actually don't know what it would have been, or we don't want to ever know if they did fire. So I think there's a lot of different implications for Syria. I don't know if they are, but it's going to be really different for that context, whatever it is, because people are going to have to overcome different barriers. And no matter how much you replicate something in protest, in social media, in news, media, anything at all, you're always going to have something different from your country. Because the biggest lesson that I feel Egypt is learning, or should be learning, is a revolution without some kind of end vision or some kind of end goal will be short-lived or long-lived, that they're not sustainable. So I think now that's the question a lot of people are asking, or should be asking, in my opinion, is what's next? How do we move from here? Who's going to English is going to share power on the moment?
And that's a very important point, is not only what's next in terms of what you might call a revolutionary ripple effect, but are there ways that the kind of unity that was aided by various forms of media in Egypt help Egypt reconstruct? And the past few weeks have done tremendous damage to the Egyptian economy. And it's going to take a while to come back. Look how important in Egypt the tourism industry is. And that's just shot for a while. And other issues, just more domestic issues involving the economy, are very, very significant. And so, you know, as watching these people out in the streets today, what are they going to be doing 2 weeks from now? Are they going to be back at their jobs, presumably, because they've got to put food on the table? Is the food going to be moving by trucks and everything through the country? And will there be, whatever new sort of governing operation there is, will they be, what are their priorities going to be? Chasing Mubarak's money, or trying to rebuild Egypt, trying to redo the Constitution in ways that will allow really free elections in September? And it's a very, very difficult time, and it'll be interesting to watch the domestic media too. I wonder what's going to happen in Nile TV. Mubarak's pals will probably be booted out, but who's going to run it? And that's, there are lots of questions. I don't know, Laurie, do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, no, those are all good questions, and I think it's an open question. I think there is this fervor now and this enthusiasm, this celebratory mood, but there are these really difficult issues that have to be addressed, and they were difficult. Some of them are sort of immediate products of problems. Others are structural in nature, long-standing. They extend across not only the Middle East, but are problems that are a result of the international economy. So not necessarily things that any individual state financial planners or ministers of economy can necessarily address. The problem of commodity prices, for example, is something that's with us now and increases, the spikes. This is going to be with us, they tell us, for some time to come. And all of these countries have gone through periods of reduction in state services, retreat of the state from the kind of social safety net that we put in place in the case of Egypt under Mubarak, in the case of Tunisia under Liba, and in other states as well. Those kinds of things aren't going to be changed significantly for some time. These states don't have lots of resources to address those things. The Gulf states do, but they don't have the same demands.
Let's take two last questions.
I wanted to hear a little bit more about the panel's thoughts on sort of the future of this new model for state-sponsored international broadcasting. We've talked a little bit about Al Jazeera and state-backed sponsor in the Middle East, and also that on Arabia. Because theoretically, this was not the intended effect of pan-Arab satellite television, was to spread news and foment revolution, because these are backed by primarily authoritarian governments. So I was wondering if we thought there would be any implications for either sort of coming down harder on the type of coverage they provide, because I know there was some controversy about that when Egypt first started to sort of look a little bit interesting about how Al Jazeera covered that. So I was curious to hear.
Well, Phil, I'd love to know whether you've been reading what's happening in Qatar. How are people feeling about this? I mean, after all, this is the possible down. It is possible that these oil-rich countries, including Qatar, could be in jeopardy with this. It's an interesting question on this.
Well, I think there are some countries that are more in jeopardy than others. Qatar has the highest per capita GDP rate in the world. So people, when you have, I think it's about $145,000 a household, they're very happy.
But how long do they survive in a neighborhood that will last such state standing?
Well, I think it's sort of a tiered thing, and Laurie knows more about this than I do, I think. But it's I think there are countries that are in much more precarious situations, such as Algeria, Yemen, perhaps, even Jordan. I'm not convinced that the king has really smoothed things out there. I think we can see change there, much more like, and of the Gulf states, I think Bahrain is the only one where there's much likelihood of any sort of revolutionary type spirit getting any traction, and that's largely a religious based matter because there's a substantial Shia population there. But I think states like the UAE and Qatar are pretty good shape. Now, Kuwait is an interesting case because there have been demonstrations there that had nothing to do with these events, and so it's just hard to say. And what about going beyond the Middle East? What about China? I mean, Andrew and I were talking earlier. What did you mention that about the Google case?
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the interesting sidebars to this is that Google exec as they've been calling them, had a very prominent role in the news in the last few days after being released. And Google actually had a project called Speak to Tweet. If some of you saw this, where when the internet was blocked, the landlines were still working in Egypt, you could call a number and the voice call would be recorded, it would be tweeted out, and Google made that a free service. The question going forward is Google now going to be seen as kind of an extension of the CIA in this sense? Is that any employee of Google around the world going to be viewed much more skeptically by regimes up there? And that's a really good question. That's a really interesting question to me, because my good friend is just about to take up a post in Google being their product manager in China. And I can imagine he's going to have the detail.
He'll never be lonely.
Yeah, it's there. And I thought I'd point out one last thing. That's one of the slides that I created after I was in Alexandria in 2008, when there was the Wikipedia conference there, was looking at what was the influence of different media. What was the influence of different media types in the Arabic blogosphere? And I wonder if you can type in this URL right there, we can show you. And it really does back up some of what Phil said, is that it's a little bit tough or inaccurate to label any of these things as the Facebook revolution or the Twitter revolution. But what really is amazing is just the fact that we now have multiple redundant streams of information, such that governments no longer have the upper hand in information arbitrage.
Can you walk us through this?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating graph. So after the conference in Alexandria, I worked with a firm and said, I want to see what's going on with the blogosphere. And this is a company called Morningside Analytics. And what they do is what they call affinity clusters or affinity graphs. These are several hundred blogs that blog in the Arabic language, the top ones. And if blogs are a bigger circle, it means that they have more posts or more activity. If they're a smaller circle, meaning that they have less activity. Blogs that tend to link to each other are closer together on this map. All right, so Kuwaiti bloggers tend to link to each other. Egyptian bloggers tend to link to each other. People who blog the Muslim Brotherhood in the lower right-hand corner tend to be closer in ideology to the Saudi Arabian bloggers, right? Much more interested in a religious form of government. So this is just a general map of what the blogosphere looks like in the Arabic language. But what's really interesting is when you start to see what sources these blogs link to. If you go to the second page here, this is a PDF document. If you look at something like torture in Egypt, you find that the secular bloggers link to this because this is a site that concentrates on human rights violations, but the Muslim Brotherhood and other folks are not that interested in this site. If you go to the next one, the New York Times is linked to by Lebanese bloggers, Kuwaiti bloggers, but not necessarily Saudi Arabian bloggers or the other folks in Egypt. But there's two main news sources that all bloggers link to. They consider these two very credible sources of information, regardless of ideology. And one of them is Al Jazeera. So you see that almost every blog in the region links to Al Jazeera, very traditional kind of BBC style of news organization. The other one is Wikipedia.
Wow.
And that's really fascinating, right? One is a traditional news organization, the other one's completely grassroots, volunteer contributed, and it doesn't matter whether you're secular or religious or in Lebanon or in Saudi Arabia, people are universally linking to these two news sources. And I think the Arabic blogosphere, Wikipedia, and Al Jazeera have been a much bigger impact in terms of letting the news spread around. But as Phil said, just the linkages that you have now between user-generated content and traditional media sources.
Andrew, you know what would be really interesting for us, for those people who debate the impact of Alhura, if you could get an Alhura comparable thing.
I can get it.
And just let Phil use it and compare it to Al Jazeera in his debate.
I'm a great Satan, according to
I know. This would be data. This would be data.
It's verbatim.
Satan, the question that I was interested in hearing the answer, I think that we might there be an effect on Al Jazeera, an attempt to censor Al Jazeera or whatever, if it's seen as having been...
Seriously, less funding next year.
Yeah, so that's what she was asking. Do you
From the Emir?
Right.
And that's why I was supporting your question.
Okay. I didn't pick that up. One of the reasons that he created, fostered out Al Jazeera, was to make Qatar and himself bigger players, both in the region and the world. I think he feels secure in his own country, and I think Al Jazeera has enhanced his standing. And if things, we'll see how things develop. But he has been involved just in the past few months in trying to broker some kind of agreement in Sudan, trying to broker an agreement in Lebanon. That's what he sees his role as being. I think he's probably delighted by all this. Now, it's interesting, in the first couple of days, and you probably noticed this, first off, Al Jazeera was probably fuming because they broke the Palestine Papers just as all this was going on.
And you know what, for a few people may not know the Palestine Papers, but Sandy referenced them before, maybe you should take a couple of cents of it. It's quite a big development.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. I mean, it was, I think, 1,600 cables, much like a WikiLeaks and sort of a Palestinian WikiLeaks. 1,600 cables, which have been essentially authenticated, certainly partly by the fact that South America, the chief Palestinian negotiator, basically tried to find the leaker and essentially verified their legitimacy. And the Guardian also printed them. And what they revealed, you know, a lot of Palestinian critics say, well, this shows that we have traitors. I mean, I think they're much more nuanced than that, but what they basically show, one thing they showed is the old Israeli cliche, we don't have a partner for peace, is absolutely not true, because the Palestinians were willing to give up a lot and in exchange for some other lands, giving up a lot of East Jerusalem settlements and other agreements on sovereignty that many Palestinians were absolutely shocked by. But this showed, it also showed the United States absolutely on the side of Israel, and the whole notion of there being the whole thing of being an honest broker was revealed. I mean, the companies of Rice basically said, if you don't give up Model Adamim to the Israeli or to the Palestinian negotiator, Abu Alum, then you won't have a state. I mean, this is not the independent broker that was supposed to be helping the two sides come together. So this was all revealed, and I think as a result, the reaction of the Palestinian civil society outside of the Palestinian Authority has been such that, especially after Cairo, as I was saying before, it's going to be awfully hard to do, especially also with the Netanyahu government not coming anywhere near what Omer was willing to do during these negotiations 3 years ago.
And this was a big scoop for Al Jazeera and the Guardian.
Yes.
And Al Jazeera covered Tunisia very aggressively. And then things started happening in Egypt, and it was interesting. I don't read Arabic, but I was looking at the Al Jazeera Arabic site, and there wasn't much there. In fact, there was just about nothing there. The Al Jazeera English site, in the first couple days in Egypt, and I don't know if you picked up on this too, and then there was this transformation, a sudden transformation, and Al Jazeera Arabic started doing what they've been doing ever since. And my thinking at first was, well, Mubarak has gotten to the emir and said, call him off. And it's in your interest that I don't get kicked out. I don't know, what's your feeling about that? Were you able to notice, was there power so you could watch television at that time?
Second day.
Yeah.
Second day we saw, the family singing we also Arabic, so we only watched Al Jazeera Arabic.
Yeah.
And then I was trying to go to English and just compare. And they were like, it's the same thing, it's the same thing. I was like, no, it's not the same thing. So we go back and forth, and you're right, in the beginning, Al Jazeera English had more, they both had coverage, but Al Jazeera Arabic just had like, kind of like scattered coverage.
Yeah.
It wasn't centralized.
Just in that stream of photos they've got, it was 1 out of 5 you could click on.
But then afterwards, probably like a day after, actually.
Yeah. Okay, one last question.
Geneva spoke a little bit earlier about
Could you talk a little louder?
Geneva spoke a little earlier about the U.S. centricity of the coverage in the United States. I'm wondering, from those who follow Arabic media who were in Egypt at the time, could comment on the relevance of the United States in this situation from the point of view of either the government and or those people in Paris.
You mean the political relevance, the relevance of
Well, I mean,
the way
were
the
they
US
following what the administration was saying? Did it matter to them?
Oh,
Did it,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, they would break in for statements from Mubarak or Secretary of State Clinton. I mean, definitely, they certainly cover what the administration is saying, and people were, I think they were keen to know what position the U.S. was taking. the fact that Kerry and McCain made statements early on, I mean, well, it was early last week, I guess, insisting Mubarak needed to step down, and that got a fair amount of play. But then, you know, as Phil has already gone through the back and forth or inconsistent line of the government, that also came through fairly quickly. And so people's disappointment with that, I think, also came through. But yeah, no, they're very interested in what they what the
But were there
US is
other
saying.
countries that were also, in this country, you don't get too much sense of what Merkel was saying or what, you know, or Sarkozy was saying or Cameron. Were there other players that the Arab media were covering what other international players said?
Well, you certainly, I mean, it's certainly in the running headlines, or whatever you all call them. I mean, anybody who was saying anything about the events in Egypt was covered. So you found out what Merkel was saying, you found out what Sarkozy was saying, you found out what Cameron was saying. Any of that was covered, up to any statements coming out. I mean, more recently, some statements coming from China, what the Chinese leadership was saying about whether this morning was either the Egyptian people have the right to determine their own fate or something like that. Now that's all over, or not all over. And I take Lydia's points very important. It's not over. This step is over. Now we have to see how this plays out. But so yeah, I mean, there is an interest and there is coverage, but I think not in this particular case. Not as much coverage for other external powers, perhaps as the U.S. I mean, U.S. most importantly, and then sort of secondarily EU and other European powers, and then sort of going down from there.
Well, can I ask one last question as we end this subject?
Just want to add quickly, I mean, to that, and I think you mentioned, Jeff, the Obama speech in June of 2009, which was, you know, sort of the high point for, I think, American public diplomacy, I guess you could say, in the Arab world. It was a brilliant speech, and steadily the United States, I think, has lost credibility in the region. And one of the reasons people aren't tuning in, I would guess, Al-Hura and Salawat, is they're not seen, the U.S. isn't seen as a fair broker in the region. I remember being in Jordan once, a while ago, and then the cab driver was listening to Al-Salawat, and as soon as the news came on, he switched. And whenever I asked him, why did you switch? He goes, well, I really like the music, but when the news comes on, it sounds like it's from Israel. I mean, we're seeing it as so pro-American, pro-Israeli, that I think that people, in some sense, are tuning the U.S. message out.
Well, I want to just say a word in defense of what VOA is supposed to be. It should not be the U.S. message. And the reason it was so credible in so much of the world, including in the Arab world, was because it wasn't biased in that way. It was criticized continuously by the State Department for being too even-handed. But that was another word for being an outstanding journalistic organization. So we hope that people listen, not because they think it's the American message, but because it's really good news. But my last question I want to ask is this. Apart from the New York Times and the LA Times, which are on the table here and everybody has here, are there any others, and apart from Al Jazeera and the news sources that have been mentioned here, are there any terrific news sources that people here would like to recommend for what we do? I'm going to throw one out. I personally think for international coverage, foreignpolicy.com, which is actually owned by the Washington Post, is a terrific continual source. Not the magazine, which obviously is just periodical, but the foreignpolicy.com covers stuff, I think, wonderfully and very richly. I'd love to hear about other things that you want to throw out.
The Economist, the old-fashioned print, hold it in your hand. I mean, you can look at the website too, but it's a terrific magazine. And in some ways, I compare it to Al Jazeera English because of the breadth of its cover. They cover parts of the world that no one else does. That's foreign policy.
Yeah, there's a nice channel for.
No, this was what I meant. Foreignpolicy.com. That's what I meant.
Foreign policy.
Right.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, there's the Middle East Channel, which is a part of this. They have different elements. The Middle East Channel actually gives.
No, this is the website of the magazine. But the point of the difference in the website is that unlike the magazine, which is going out periodically, like the print version, this is updated momentarily. And you're saying it has a Middle East
Channel. Yeah, it's
Channel.
called the Middle East Channel, which features, I have had a piece a couple of weeks ago about comparing Tunisia and Jordan. So it has new op-ed pieces, several new ones, and particularly now in Egypt, there's new stuff coming through all the time. And from a variety of points of view, it's a joint project between Foreign Policy Magazine and the Program on Political Science, for which I'm a board member. And so it's a very good project on political science. So that, I think it's, I mean, there are a lot of pieces I don't agree with, but that's great, because it really, I think, does provide just different points of view coming in from all different kinds of pieces. They're relatively short and accessible. There, a number of them are written by academics, but they're not written.
And it's so much better than the Washington Post.
There's globalvoices.com, if you've ever seen that.
Which was created actually by the Berkman Center at Harvard.
Exactly. So they've been building up a nice syndicate of bloggers who blog from around the world, and they've got great coverage of not just Egypt, but the whole region of folks on the ground. Global Voices, I just do a Google search. I can't remember Global Voices.
Global Post is another one.
GlobalVoicesOnline.org.
It'll be interesting to see what some of the Egyptian need. I mean, even in the last few days, there's some very pro-demonstrator, anti-regime voices on Al-Afram online, which is supposed to be, which is a state-run thing, which people like Hani Shukala, Asmi Bashar were very critical. We're running regular columns, which I found fascinating. I thought, wait a minute, this is a different Al-Afram. And you know, because Hani was an old friend who was like sacked by them a few years ago. Comes back, this very critical column, so that's going to be a space that will open up. It's Al-Afram online, which is a good show.
So Bill, do we end these things by saying this will continue in the green room?
Well, this has been, I think, a great panel. Thank you all panelists and audience for coming. And you know, that if you had used these three words a month ago, democratic Middle East, you would have been locked away as incurably insane. And it's too early to use them with great confidence now, but at least you can speak those words and have some hope. So let's keep watching things, and thank you all for being there.